Good afternoon and welcome to Moments with Melinda. I am your host, Melinda Moulton, and today my guest is Lauren-Glenn Davitian. Hi, Lauren-Glenn.
Hello, Melinda.
I'm so
So
glad you're on my show.
it's very thrilling. I feel so honored. I think it's been a long time
It
since
has
we
been.
yeah.
And I wouldn't have this show if it wasn't for you.
Well, if yeah,
No,
CCTV and all the marvelous people.
I just want to tell my viewers that without Lauren-Glenn Davitian, this show would not be happening. So I want to tell my folks a little bit about you.
Okay.
Um, Lauren-Glenn Davitian, for 40 years, was the executive director of CCTV Center for Media and Democracy. Lauren-Glenn stepped down from this position in 2022 to take on special projects for the organization. Is that
Sounds
correct?
right. Yep.
So I want to share with my viewers that you and I met many, many years ago when I first created the show On the Waterfront. And that was in 2020. And we did the show because nobody knew that there was anything on the waterfront. So we did it in conjunction with the Burlington Business Association. It was a
Was
month.
it
Huh?
was it earlier than 2020?
My first show was 2020, and Nancy Barnett was my guest.
Wow. I feel like you've been doing this show for 25 years, but go ahead. Yeah. You're
Well,
so
it is.
prolific.
Well, it is almost 25 if it was 2020.
2020,
I mean,
2020.
2020. I'm sorry. Boy, oh boy, I need to drink more tea. It was in the year 2000.
That's what I thought. Okay, good. All right. I just want
I'm
to make sure.
sorry. Excuse to my viewers that I just have to get my math together here. It was in the year 2000, so it's been 25 years.
Yeah.
And my first guest was Nancy Barnett. And I had big hair and oh gosh, those were the
Sure.
days.
Yeah.
And the only show where a guest did not show up, I only had one in 25 years where a guest did not show up. And that back then it was a live show. Lauren-Glenn Davitian agreed to stand in. She was at her desk working. And I ran into her office. I said, I need somebody on my show. It's starting in 5 minutes. And Lauren-Glenn stepped up and did the interview. And I got to tell you, it remains today one of my most favorite interviews.
Thank you. It was great to do. And
It
I
was,
bet Ben can find that footage and insert it here so we can see it.
boy, that would be so cool because you brought up stuff about, Bernie, and you told the whole history of CCTV. Good evening and welcome to On the Waterfront. My name is Melinda Moulton and I am here with Lauren-Glenn Davitian, who is the executive director of CCTV.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, how are you?
Happy new era.
Thank you very much.
So we started CCTV in 1984, and then Channel 17 was started in 1990. So the first access, it wasn't exactly the first access channel. There were in the late 70s in St. Johnsbury and in Brattleboro, where there were channels that were set aside and people ran community meetings on those channels. So that was really some of the first public access to cable TV in the country, actually, was in Vermont.
It doesn't surprise me.
I know, of course.
It's sort of the first of most of
Exactly.
those things.
But the real sort of beginning of the movement was in 1984 when we went to the cable company and asked them to open up a channel and give us equipment. It was Cox Cable, and they laughed at us. And we said, you can't be laughing at us. That's no good. I mean, they just sort of thought it was kind of comic. So we went out and started organizing people who wanted access. People from the library, people from City Hall. Bernie Sanders was
Bernie
mayor.
mayor then?
Yeah. So he liked that idea. People from unlikely corners, educators, I mean, not so unlikely, but just all kinds of people came out of the woodwork and said, this is something that we want. We think this idea of having a channel for public speech is a very good idea and a very unusual idea.
So now we're going to do it again today because a lot of my viewers, younger viewers may not know the history of CCTV. So let's get going. So let's start at the beginning. Share with us a little bit about your early days as a child and growing up.
Oh my goodness, that's the beginning. So I grew up in New York City. People from outside of the city would call it Manhattan. And my mother was a debutante from Buffalo, New York, and my father was a bookmaker from the city. And he became a stockbroker, which was a legitimate form of being a bookmaker. And we had a great life in the 60s. I was born in 1960, and New York was, a marvelous place. It still is. I think, it's changed a lot, but it was a great place to grow up. And they were wonderful parents. My mother was the best. My father was funny, kind of cross between Mel Brooks and Frank Sinatra. So very suave and very funny. And my grandmother, his mother, she's an Armenian. Um, she came over after the genocide, but she and her husband ended up in New York City, and my father grew up there. So she was very big in my life, my Virginia, and that I saw her every week, every Saturday night. I'd go to her house. And I went to schools. I went to parochial schools. It was sort of a kind of mix between the private and the public. So I ended up in parochial schools. And then I went to high school at Marymount High School, which was across from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And it was really a leadership academy for women that had been started by nuns in the 20s and was a remarkable opportunity, great school. And that was the time when, the church was really changing. Vatican II had happened, and the nuns were all out of their habits and coming out and leaving the convent. And it was a very free time, a very exciting time. And, we had the run of New York. We had the run of the city as teenagers. And we were very involved in, at that time, the Ramones and Blondie. These were the Talking Heads were just starting up, Laurie Anderson. These were the bands that were at the clubs. So we spent a lot of time there hanging around with those people. And then going to the movies, went to lots of movies. That was sort of high school. And then my mother had inherited a house in Kennebunkport from her aunt, my great aunt. And so one day we were driving from Maine, and this was before Kennebunkport was Kennebunkport, really. We were driving from there, I think, to look at Dartmouth, maybe. I don't know, it was college looking time. And we drove through Vermont, and it was the kind of experience that since then I understand people have. You see the green grass, you see the blue sky, the yellow sun. It's just this mesmerizing moment. And I turned to my mother in the car and I said, I have to be here. This is where I have to be. And so I applied to schools that were in New England, essentially, and I was accepted at UVM. And so I arrived here in 1978. And then I went on to study anthropology. And I was in Edinburgh for a year at the university there. And then I can just stop because that's sort of the end of my early life and then the beginning of staying in Burlington. And I can talk about why I stayed, but
So,
those.
so Lauren-Glenn, who would you say was your greatest inspiration on following the path that you took in your life?
Well, I think my grandparents, my grandmother for sure, my father's mother and my mother's father, they were my two grandparents that I had. The other two had passed. My grandmother was a seamstress and a small business owner. She had small dress shops, and she was an incredibly hard worker, woman of profound faith. She went to church every day. She had lived through, being taken from her town because the Turks were coming and being raised in an orphanage convent away from her parents. She never saw her parents again. So she was, and then she married this man she didn't know, got on a boat with him because he was looking for an Armenian wife and came to the United States with my grandfather and, created a life out of nothing. And she was the kindest, sweetest, dearest, most loving person. So she was a huge influence on me, just in all ways. And then my mother's father, he lived outside of Buffalo, New York, and he was a Renaissance person. He could do anything. He could build, he could invent. He was a very fine artist, and he ran the family company, which was Cleaners, Polishes, and Waxes, the Emulso Corporation, that he had taken over from his father. His father, I think, sort of had a nervous collapse. And so my grandfather had to leave art school. He was at Pratt and come back to Buffalo and run this company. And then he built his own house, and he was an incredible, just a amazing, generative person who, I was the light of his life. So we had a great time. I think other people were a little afraid of him, but not me. And he was, another just profound inspiration. And then I would say also my parents, my mother made everything beautiful, and she had a hard time. She's manic depressive, and she had a hard time, but she got up every single day and tried to make it as beautiful as possible. And my father was just a funny, smart, generous guy who, he grew up, they didn't have anything. He was not a rich person, and he really, again, they both created themselves and they created their lives, which in the post-war 60s could be done. Like you weren't hampered by class at that time. It was sort of everyone was busting out of, we see it now as that institutions have completely crumbled. Religion and education and politics and parties, and it's like all blown up. Gender, it's all blown up. But that started in the 60s, and that was really a response to Western culture and how constraining it was. My father was Catholic, my mother was Presbyterian, and it was a mixed marriage. It's a big deal. But they created an entirely new life, as did their friends and the people of that time. And I just, I applaud them for inventing themselves, and for all the benefits and privilege that I have accrued from those marvelous people.
What a great story. So what did you do right after UVM before you ended up at channel at CCTV?
Well, I studied anthropology, so I was an anthropologist. And during college, Dan Higgins, even though he was in the art department, was my mentor. And I did my, I was in Edinburgh in my junior year at the university. And that's where I encountered John Grierson. And John Grierson he had since passed, but he initiated the British Film Board and then the Canadian Film Board. And he was called to do this work because during the Second World War, the Nazi propaganda machine was very powerful and very demoralizing for people in Great Britain. And so he was called to use the film board as a way to unite what was then, and still is, a very split country, split by class, split by geography, and to create a sense of national identity through film. And he wrote quite a bit about this and the use of propaganda as a tool for democracy, as opposed to propaganda as a tool for fascism, which is what was happening on the other side of the channel. And then he was hired by the Canadian government to start the Canadian Film Board to, again, create a sense of Canadian national identity of a country that was 3,000 miles wide and about 100 miles deep. And that's where the documentary movement really took off. I mean, it had taken off before for sure, but in Canada, films were made, all kinds of films were made about the people in the country. And then at once a week, if you lived in a small community, someone would show up with a film canister and you'd go down to the church and everybody would watch this film. So weekly, there were films about Canadian experience. And then there was a kind of backlash in the 60s against this top-down version of reality, and different ethnic groups in Canada wanted representation. And so they started a project called Challenge for Change. And they put video cameras in the hands of young filmmakers who went into communities and made video as a social organizing tool. So I learned all about this when I was in Edinburgh, and I saw these films. And there's a very famous one called VTR Saint Jacques, which is set in Montreal in a neighborhood called Saint Jacques. And the filmmakers are videotaping people in the community who say, well, what do you want to see changed? And the people in the community, right on the street, not in the studio, and these are not portable cameras, I mean, they're pretty clunky, would say, well, we need, jobs, we need healthcare, we need daycare. And then the organizers, filmmakers would say, well, come Wednesday night, we're going to screen everybody's responses. And people came and they saw that they had common cause, they had common purpose. And from those meetings, they decided, this group of neighborhood people decided to work on projects. Like, let's get a daycare center going. So the use of video at that time, I mean, film and then video as a tool for social organizing really resonated with me. I mean, when I read Grierson's work, his Searchlight on Democracy, his essays, I just felt like, oh, this is what I think. I mean, hadn't been able to articulate it, but when I read it, and then when I saw these films, I was just like, oh, this is what I think, and this is my work. This is my work.
This is your calling,
Right.
right?
And, it was very clear. I mean, I was 20 years old. I mean, it's been a blessing and a burden to know what to do, but from that age on, I knew exactly, I mean, not exactly what it was going to be, but the shape of it. So when I came back to UVM for my senior year, I did my thesis on Winooski and the transformation of the woolen mills, from the woolen mills to these commercial, what was then a big commercial shopping district and housing across the river. And Dan Higgins was my mentor. And I did a lot of audio interviews. I didn't really use video at the time. I used audio and slides and a little video, and wrote this thesis called The Frogs Across the Pond, because that's what people in Burlington used to call people in Winooski. And it was about change. And that's where I met a lot of people that, I still know today, but the people who had been the mayors of Winooski, or the guy O'Brien who had run the woolen mills. And, I learned about the geographic distinction between the English-speaking people that were up on the hill and the French-speaking people that were down by the river, and just the social stratification and sort of the urban, rural, and working in the mills, and people saying, I would never eat at that restaurant in the mills because I work there and there were rats running around. So who would ever go eat at Waterworks? It's just this amazing way of immersing into the life of a community. And I became very close with one family in particular who I went to school with, their son, the Tronos. And then when it came time to graduate, there were a number of things in place. One was I had these relationships that were quite, meaningful. My mother had moved to Burlington, so I lived with my mother and we lived together. And Bernie was mayor, which was an incredibly exciting time to be a young person, to have this kind of political agency, which I knew if I went back to the city, it wouldn't be like that at all. So I stayed in Burlington, and I knew, the people that had the Challenge for Change project in Canada was documented, had an executive producer by the name of George Stoney. And George Stoney had been hired to run the program. And then he went to NYU, and he realized that video was a tool for social change. And so he started the Alternative Media Center with a woman named Red Burns, and they trained the first generation of video activists, who then went out across the country and started to tug at the sleeves of cable companies and say, you could set aside channels and equipment for public use. And this coincided with some things happening at the FCC, where the FCC made a 15-minute requirement that time be set aside for the public. That was overthrown. So there was a lot of legislative and legal stuff happening, but even without the law, which didn't happen until 1984, the Cable Communications Act, which was allowed for public access TV, even without that, there was this thing called public access TV. And I again, I followed this trail, and Bernie had at that time the mayor's cable TV task force because he wanted me to municipalize cable at that time in 1983. And so there are just a lot of things in place. So I marched myself to the cable company and I said, where's your cameras? Where's the channels? And they laughed at me. I mean, they didn't laugh, but they kind of laughed because they had this closet, Cox Cable marked closet. It's kind of famous story. And inside was this clunky camera. And I realized, oh, I need to become an organizer. Like, I want to be a documentary maker, but this is not my job. My job is to now explain to every single person I run into what public access TV is. And then the cable company was going for a rate increase. And at that time, they had to get permission for a rate increase from the Public Service Board. And I had organized enough people, including Sam Press, who was a young lawyer who had just come back from DC, grew up in Burlington, come back from DC. And we went to the Public Service Board. And we were the first public advocates they'd ever seen. Louise McCarran was the chair at the time. And this is before environmental activism was a thing, public activism. And we put our ducks in a row, and Sam, figured out what the administrative rules were. And we made a case for this thing called public access television. And Cox Cable had public access all over the country, so they knew what it was. And they, even before they were required to by the Public Service Board, they made a proposal to fund and set aside channels in Burlington, in Middlebury, in Rutland, in Montpelier. And that was how we got the first funding for community media.
Wow, that covered quite a few of my questions.
There you go.
What an incredible story. So a few things that I wanted to talk about, and but I've got to pick out now what's the most important that I want to really focus on. So you recently, CCTV, I mean, you were there for almost 40 years, and now you're there as special projects, a leader in the special projects. So you're still with Channel 17 CCTV, but you joined forces recently with Vermont Language Justice Project, I believe. Fight for language access and deliver public health messages in 16 languages. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think it's 19 now. So since the media landscape turned from analog to digital, that is, the internet was invented for public use, that was a big turning point. And that happened, roughly in 1990. And at that time, it was very clear to us that, public access cable TV was a thing, but that this idea of what community media was in a digital age was much broader, and that we needed to expand our brief. And so in the mid-1990s, we received part of a big HUD grant the city got, and we started the Old North End Community Technology Center as a way of creating public access to computers and job training for low-income people, job seekers, and nonprofit organizations. And then those projects morphed over time into different projects, including in 2008, Common Good Vermont, which is a nonprofit support project that was network-based and, a different take on the nonprofit association that Vermont had that wasn't viable at that time. And so we kind of took it up and created a new model. So we've always been looking for different ways to serve the public and the needs of the public using media, right? Because it isn't media for media's sake. It's to improve the lives of people and to make change. And so in 2020, at the pandemic, Allison Seeger at her kitchen table, she's a social worker with Howard, created this project, Vermont Language Justice Project, to translate COVID messages for different language communities because they weren't getting the message. We weren't translating this important public health information. And so she started that project, and under her leadership, it has expanded to 19 languages and a variety of messages. That's funded by federal grants and also private contracts. And so at the point where she received a pretty major COVID-related federal grant, they needed a house, they needed a fiscal agent. And so we said, well, this aligns with our strategy, our strategic planning, and it's right up our alley. And we also have the administrative capacity to support it. So we support Allison's project. It's quite amazing. And it is basically, these messages are translated by 19 different people who are trusted representatives of those language communities. And so the messages really resonate, and they also help distribute the messages to their language communities. So it's been a very effective program, and we're very proud to be part of it.
As well, you should be. So just the other day, last Thursday, at Main Street Landing, you showed a film that is in the works covering the last, I believe, 50 years for CCTV. And it's just a really great piece. Can you talk a bit about it and let us know when it will be completed and where
Yeah,
people will be able to see it?
it was great to see you there. It's nice to see you in the audience. Yeah, there were so many great people. More than 100 something people came.
60, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a great night. And so Miles Jewell, who's also an anthropologist and a filmmaker and teaches at UVM, I think he had the same kind of experience I did. I think he ran into community media and said, oh my goodness, this is what I think media should be used for. It's the highest and best use of the tools that we have. And one thing led to another, and he found us. He ran into us at CCTV and brings his students to us. And then he decided he wanted to spend some of his time making a documentary about this work. So for the last 2.5, it feels like maybe 3 years, we've been working with Miles, and he's been documenting my transition from being ED to Megan O'Rourke and Mohammed Al-Rubai becoming the co-directors. And he's dug into the archives, and we've been working on versions of this documentary. And so on Thursday, we showed a half-hour work sample. So it's parts, it's sort of sections of the documentary. And I think it's going to be another year before it's done. And it'll be a great story to tell about the work that we've done and the work that's happening all over the country and all over the world, and how community media is essentially different from YouTube and social media platforms. I mean, people ask us a lot, they're like, so we have YouTube, why do we need community media? It's like, well, YouTube isn't a media platform, it's a surveillance system. It's part of a larger surveillance system,
Good point.
which we call social media.
Good point. So what do you see for the future of our country as it relates to free speech, democracy, and the freedom of the press?
Well, that's such a huge question, isn't it? The idea of free speech is evolving rapidly right now, especially in this period of time. And my beliefs about free speech, I think, are a little bit in conflict with, and I'll say what my beliefs are. I mean, my beliefs about free speech is that the antidote to hate is more speech. So if someone from the Ku Klux Klan wants to come in and use public access TV, they need to be allowed to come in and do that. And then we have a responsibility to, as people who don't advocate for a particular position, to counter program and find other voices.
Hear, hear.
But people need to make up their own mind. And I think by clamping down on speech, you kind of take away people's ability to think critically. And just because we have done so poorly in our education system to not teach people to think critically doesn't mean you don't keep trying to do this. So, that comes into conflict, I think, with some of the positions of some of the younger people that have worked with us who feel like hate speech is and other people, not just the young people that work for us, is dangerous and has a physical cost, which I don't disagree with at all. And I feel so strongly that unless we have an open forum, then, unless everyone can agree that the forum should be open, then when the political winds change, those of us who have left-leaning opinions, we get shut out.
Hear, hear.
So in order to create a safe place for everyone in order to create a safe space for the left, honestly, you need to have a forum in which everyone can come and speak, including if the right or however you want to call it. So I think that's important. And I think we have to, I'm committed to that view. And I'm also open to the discussions that take place around this topic, because that's, again, how we expand understanding and we learn to understand each other. Because, at the end of the day, we have to figure out ways to live together so that we can make this place the best possible place for especially people that don't have the opportunities that we do. And that's I feel that's my responsibility as a person who has been blessed by so many blessings and so much privilege. So, to work together with people, even if you don't agree with them, is required, because there's a lot of work to do.
It's really true. So as we're getting to the end of the show, what words of wisdom would you give our children, Lauren-Glenn, as they face their futures on a warming planet, authoritarianism, and where do they find hope and purpose to be the kind of change maker for the best that you have been?
Yeah, I think it really boils down to building relationships with other people and seeking first to understand. I think that the answers to the bigger problems really starts with our abilities to open up our hearts and be curious about other people and not let labels and, get in our way. There's certain situations where you need to be smart and kind of avoid them, but in the end, well, at this point, not in the end, in the beginning, we have to really be curious about other people's experience and read and look at history and understand that this is, this political period is not a new political period. It comes around and around and around. And capitalism, which is the economic order that we're in, has a very high cost. And I think in order to understand all of those things, we need to, again, be open to learning and reaching out beyond our particular points of view to find out what other people think and what other things have happened before us.
Well, that is all the time that we have, Lauren-Glenn. Thank you so much for your time and for the opportunity to have my show produced by CCTV, Center for Media and Democracy. And your website it's cctv.org, isn't it?
But yeah,
That's
yeah.
right. So for my viewers, go visit the website, cctv.org. It's a great website. And thank you. Thank you, Lauren-Glenn, for your service to our community and to Vermont. It's just been such a pleasure to know you, and I look forward to many more moments with you.
Oh, Melinda, thank you. I can't even begin to say what a treasure it is to know you and be in your orbit. So thanks so much.
Thank you. And to my viewers, I wish you a beautiful Thanksgiving, and I'll see you shortly. Goodbye.